What is statutory interpretation? Statutory interpretation is the process by which judges determine the meaning and application of words and phrases in legislations and statutes passed by the Parliament. Now, why is it important? Because in a legal system, laws are always written in general, ambiguous, and unclear terms, sometimes even having multiple meanings. Judges need to interpret the statutes to ensure that justice is served well and the Parliament's intention with the legislation is carried out correctly. This presentation will cover the different approaches to interpretation: the literal rule, the golden rule, and the mischief rule. Also, the aids to interpretation, including the internal aids and the external aids. And further, it will elaborate on the key cases that illustrate how each rule and aid is applied in real legal decisions. Now I pass it on to Joanne, who will elaborate further on this.
The literal rule is a rule of statutory interpretation that requires the judges to focus on the actual words used and give them their plain and grammatical meanings, even if it may lead to unreasonable or undesirable outcomes. In applying this rule, the judges more focusing on the wording of the statute rather than the Parliament's intentions. In other words, the law must be interpreted exactly as written instead of altered or misshaped. The literal rule has several pros and cons. On the positive side, it applies parliamentary sovereignty, as the judges simply apply the law without rewriting it. Moreover, it provides certainty, which allowing the ordinary people and the person with legal knowledge to rely on the clear wording of the statutes. However, despite this strength, the rules can also lead to absurd results, which the Parliament never intended. For instance, in the Whiteley and Chapel case, the defendant was charged with impersonating any person entitled to vote, and he had used the name of a dead person. But since a dead person is not entitled to vote, the court acquitted him. This case illustrates how a strict application of the literal rule can ignore the obvious purpose of the law, which to prevent electoral fraud. In addition, the literal rule often overlooks the broader context or the purpose of the law and remains inflexible, which failing to adapt to evolving language or the social norms. As a result, it can sometimes undermine the fairness in modern interpretation. Another case which further illustrates this application of the rule is United Biscuit Company and the Commissioners of Customs and Excise, which involved the value-added taxation classification of the Jaffa cakes. The issue was whether there were cakes which is zero rated or biscuit that is standard rated. The court applied the literal rule, which focusing on the ordinary meaning of the cakes, and it found that Jaffa cakes had the characteristic of a cake, which is soft sponge textures, similar ingredients, and brand still, they harden like cakes rather than soften that like biscuits. Similarly, in Fisher Bell case, a shopkeeper displayed a flint knife with a price tag in his shop window but had not sold any. The court held that this was merely an invitation to trade, but not an offer for sale, which based on the literal meaning of the words in the contract law. This case showed that the literal rule relies strictly on the ordinary meaning of words. This can resolve uncertainty by keeping the law clear and predictable, yet it may also create uncertainty when the literal meanings produce results which Parliament never intended.
Scholars have also criticized the literal rule for creating confusion in the modern interpretations. Simamba, in a journal article, argues that the so-called plain meaning rule is often misunderstood and inconsistently applied, creating uncertainty over how judges identify the ordinary meaning of the legislations. His analysis shows that the literalism, although seemingly straightforward, can be conceptually unstable and may produce interpretations that fail to reflect legislative purpose and intent. This highlights how the literal rule can undermine fairness and flexibility in contemporary contexts.
The golden rule is a modification of the literal rule. Judges will start by looking at the ordinary meaning of the words in a statute, and if by applying the ordinary meaning an absurd or unjust outcome results, they may slightly change their interpretation for a more favorable outcome. The main purpose of the Golden Rule is to avoid results that Parliament couldn't have intended. There are two ways that judges apply the Golden Rule: the narrow approach and the broad approach. Under the narrow approach, the words have more than one possible meaning, and the judge simply just picks the meaning that leads to a less absurd outcome. A good example of this can be seen in Adler and George 1964. In this case, the defendant was charged with obstructing a member of the armed forces by being in the vicinity of a prohibited place. He argued that he was actually inside the place. The courts used the narrow Golden Rule approach to interpret "in the vicinity of" as including being inside, because it would be ridiculous if someone outside could be guilty for something that someone inside could not. The broad approach goes further. Here, the words have one clear meaning, but if by applying that meaning it would lead to an absurd or just immoral result, the court may choose to depart from the wording in the statute. This can be seen in the case Rees-Sigsworth 1935, where a son murdered his mother. Literally, he would have inherited her estate as her next of kin, but the court applied the broad Golden Rule approach to prevent him from benefiting from his own crime. Judges will usually prefer the Golden Rule over the literal rule when looking at the literal meaning of the word would lead to absurdities or just immoral results in general, and they can still stay faithful to Parliament's wording while delivering justice. So in summary, the Golden Rule is a flexible tool used to correct absurdities in legislation, applied narrowly when words are ambiguous and broadly when literal meaning leads to injustice.
Mischief rule plays an important role in helping judges to discover Parliament's true intention behind a law, especially when the wording is ambiguous and outdated. The origin of the mischief rule developed from Hayden's case. The courts set out 4 points to consider. Firstly, what was the common law before the Act? Second, what was the mischief for which the common law did not provide? Thirdly, what remedy did Parliament create? And lastly, what is the reason of the remedy? In other words, judges should interpret the law to stop the mischief and advances the remedy. One of the key cases that apply mischief rule is Smith and Huff's case. The defendants were charged with Section 1 of the Street Offences Act 1959, which say, "It shall be an offense for soliciting in a street or public places for the purposes of the prostitution." However, they were soliciting from the balcony and windows, which is not in a street or public place. The court then applied the mischief rule, holding that the purpose of the act was to clean up the streets from solicitation. So even if they were not physically on the street, they were still offending. And in another case is Royal College of Nursing and Department of Health and Social Security. The wording of the Abortion Act 1967, which stated that the abortion should be carried out by a registered medical practitioner. However, with medical improvement, nurses began performing parts of the procedure under doctor's supervision. If the literal rule was applied, this abortion would be illegal. Therefore, the House of Lords applied the mischief rule and decided that the purpose of the act was to ensure safe and legal abortion, but not to restrict the medical progress. Therefore, nurses working under doctor's supervision were acting within the law. According to the legal scholar Michael Zander, the advantage of mischief rule is it allows judges to interpret the laws in line with Parliament's true intention, rather than being bound by the strict literal meaning of the words. This makes the law more flexible and helps it stay relevant over time. To sum it up, the mischief rule is an important interpretative tool that focuses on the purpose of the law. It allows judges to bridge the gap between the wording and the true intention of the Parliament.
In his article, Parliamentary Debates in Statutory Interpretation, a question of admissibility or of weight, Stephen Biolak explains that the mischief rule, which comes from Hayden's case, helps courts identify the problem in the old law that the Parliament wanted to fix. He notes that the courts used to allow parliamentary debates only for this limited purpose, but argues that this distinction is outdated because understanding the mischief and understanding the Parliament's intention naturally goes hand in hand. He suggests that instead of excluding parliamentary debates, courts should allow them and simply decide how much weight to give to them, since they can genuinely help clarify the problem that the statute was initially meant to address.
The purposive approach is a method of statutory interpretation whereby the court prioritizes the underlying meaning and the purpose in the law rather than literal reading of its words in the cases. So, under a purposive approach, the judges examine the mischief or the problem that the law is meant to solve, and the overall context of the statute, and also external materials such as parliamentary debates. This approach has developed significantly in comparison to the limitations available for the literal and golden rule, which will sometimes produce unjust or unreasonable outcomes in cases or issues in the court. An example case that can be applied in a Mager and St. Mary's Rural District Council and Newport Corporation 1952 case, Lord Denning argued that the judges should fill in the gaps and also give effect to what the Parliament meant instead of what the literal meaning said. Although the House of Lords criticized Lord Denning's view, the purposive approach later gained recognition and is used and influence of the European Union as well as the human rights law. There are also a few key purposes to why courts nowadays choose to use the purposive approach instead of the other methods in the statutory interpretation. First off, this approach has been implemented to explain the legislation that best fulfills the Parliament's intention. Just so, this would prevent the unreasonable or unjust outcomes that would come out during interpretation. Besides that, the purposive approach allows flexibility in interpretation where statutory language can be too complex or complicated for the normal people to understand. Another example case that applies with the purposive approach in the statutory interpretation is a case named Public Prosecutor and Datuk Pan Cheng Swee and Anwar in 1980, where the two parties, Datuk Pan Cheng Swee and another, were charged under the Prevention of Corruption Act 1961 for allegedly committing acts of corruption. In the case, the federal court rejected the narrow literal approach. It held that the purpose of the Prevention Act 1961 was to eradicate corruption in all forms and use the purposive approach as the Parliament's intention to punish all corruption. Thus, this case aligns with Section 78 of the Interpretation Acts 1948 and 1967, which codifies the purposive rule in Malaysia, stating that in the interpretation of a provision of an act, a construction that will promote the purpose or object underlying the act shall be preferred to a construction that will not promote the purpose or object. Essentially, the purposive approach helps resolve uncertainty by allowing the courts to focus on the law's purpose and meaning to produce just outcomes in different kinds of cases that will happen in the court.
To comprehend legislations, the court uses tools to assist them and to help them interpret the rules and acts. For example, there are internal aids and there are external aids. In Dyson Holdings Limited and Fox case, the plaintiff argued that the word family in the Rent Act 1968 was not applicable in this case because the defendant and their late partner was not legally married. However, the court held that the word family is used and is seen as to a normal person how they would see it. So, therefore, in this case, the defendant was given protection and given the right to be the successor of the house that they were arguing about. Internal aids are help within the law. For example, the long title of an act, explanatory notes, and the definitions of a section within the act. For external aids, it is help with outside of the law. For example, there are rules for interpretations for external aids because this makes the courts have more assistance and is very, very beneficial for the courts to use. For example, of these rules that I'm going to give is contextual interpretation. It is inevitable that the courts may need help to understand the background of some culture, of a language, of a religion to help within the case. Therefore, this contextual interpretation helps them to understand the context of the case and the background information to help them get into a decision. Other than that, dictionaries are also a part of external aids. Dictionaries help to convey definitions or any ambiguous terms that the courts may need to understand. Dictionaries are a very, very good help. Furthermore, have you ever heard about Hansard? Hansard is a documented recording of parliamentary debates which are used in courts to help also assist them, which is a part of external aid. These parliamentary recordings are updated every single day, so there are no repetitions, no mistakes, and they are edited by the Hansard reporters themselves. Did you know there was a case that helped the courts use Hansard in the courts? The case name is Pepper and Hart. Pre-Pepper and Hart, the courts could not use Hansard because there was a prohibitionary rule that said they could not use it. After Pepper and Hart, the court held that there was the use of Hansard was admissible when the legislation was ambiguous or they could not get a straightforward answer out of the legislation itself. In conclusion, internal and external aids are very, very helpful for statutory interpretation. It helps the courts and the judges to understand the misleading or ambiguous or uncertainty in a case, in an act, therefore making the court cases and the court proceedings more efficient and faster. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping up with us so far. Now, let's review and see what we've learned about statutory interpretation. We've discussed statutory interpretation, which is imperative to the judicial system in truly delivering fair justice. It's more than just reading words off a piece of paper. It's about the true foundation of justice and its purpose in society. Along with relevant cases and journal articles, we learn about the different approaches to the interpretation of legislative acts and statutes that judges use in arriving at a decision for cases, namely the literal rule that talked about Simamba's article on the plain rule meaning, the golden rule, as mentioned in the International Journal of Law, Management and Humanities. The literal rule focuses on the exact meaning of the words in legal language, and the golden rule interprets the words to avoid absurdities and inconsistencies that may arise from a literal interpretation. And lastly, the mischief rule, as stated in Stephanie Bulak's article that we have talked about earlier, is based on the purposive approach, which does not allow unjust or absurd outcomes by following the verbatim of a legislative act and puts the intention of the lawmakers above the actual words of the act. Lastly, courts and judges take the help of precedents in deciphering the intent of a legislation. These are divided into internal and external aids to avoid ambiguous interpretation. All of the previously stated points goes to show that statutory interpretation is the backbone of the justice system by fairly carrying out the intent of the lawmakers. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and like for more.